So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to VizConnect, connecting you with the art of data visualization and storytelling. VizConnect is all about how we can go ahead, connect with each other and learn from each other with respect to what are the best practices with respect to data visualization and storytelling. So it started last year with the help of one of the Tableau ambassador, Divya Bharti. And so far, we have hosted close to 50 episodes. So this is our 50th episode of VizConnect. Kudos to the team for going ahead and helping us to go ahead and scale it. And this has been possible with the help of our awesome community members. So thanks to all the Tableau's Gen Master community members and Tableau champions who have gone ahead and shared their story on our platform. So we have our YouTube channel. Just go ahead and subscribe to it. It's by the name of VizConnect. Some great content waiting for you. We have a community group on LinkedIn by the name of VizConnect. Go ahead, join that group. Some great content waiting for you. Connect with each other, learn some best practices from each other. So on 26th of August, Tableau Live APAC is coming. So I will recommend you go ahead and register for it. So it will be around 11 a.m. Singapore time. Some great content for you, an opportunity to go ahead and meet the APAC community and data family. With that, let me introduce you to our speaker for today. His name is Reid. Marc is a Tableau Zen Master and a data visualization developer at Lloyd's Banking Group in London, and has been using Tableau since early 2017 when he joined the data school program at the Information Lab. He enjoys experimenting with Tableau's new features and is a frequent contributor to the beta program. And today, Marc will talk us about Tableau animations. So without further ado, Marc, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Sagar. Just check that you can hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. I'm just sharing my screen now, so I hope you can see that.
I see your screen. Yeah, please go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. So hi everyone, welcome, and thanks for joining the session today on the core concepts of animation in Tableau. So just to give you a brief introduction, so as Sagar mentioned, I'm a Tableau developer at Lloyd's Banking Group based in London, using Tableau for about 3.5 years now, and been a Tableau public ambassador for the last year or so. And I was very honoured to be invited to be a Tableau Zen Master at the start of this year. So just to give you a bit of context around where the content that I'll be sharing today comes from, I actually wrote a blog post about animation of this year. I'll just bring that up on screen here for a second to show you that. So this blog post was focusing on why we use animations and what they can help us to achieve, some of the challenges they can help us to overcome when we're sharing content. So I talk about some of the pre-attentive attributes of motion that are used with animation, talk about where the feature came into Tableau, and we look at some examples of visualizations. So here, for example, I'm showing a series of visualizations that don't have animation. And you can see that some of the challenges that we would face when we are using and switching between those visuals. I then move on to talk about object constancy and some of the settings for animation in the product, and then show how the animation is used to then transition between those visuals that I showed previously, and how that helps to overcome some of the challenges that I talk about. So one thing I didn't really get into in this particular blog post and this content was actually how you create these. And that was something I always planned to do, was follow up this first blog post with a follow-on post and look at that content of how you create these and some of the calculations and what happens behind the scenes. And that's really what I'm looking to cover today. So just to quickly go through the rest of the content here, we're looking at sorting. So this is sorting marks in the view without animation. And then with animation, you can see it's much easier to track those. And then I talk about simultaneous versus sequential transitions and the different phases of animation. So we have marks exiting the view, moving, sorting, entering. And with simultaneous transitions, those 4 stages happen at the same time, as you can see in this animation. And when you move to sequential transitions, those 4 stages happen one after the other. So for example, here you can see that Marc's exiting the view and then they're moving, and then you get the sorting happening afterwards. Okay, and then there's one final animation where I look at changing the level of detail within a scatter plot, and we'll show you how you do that as well. Okay, so this is what we plan to cover today. We're going to go right back to some fundamentals. We're going to talk about what is a mark, what does that mean in Tableau. We're looking at the level of detail, the view LOD, and how you define that. We're then going to talk about what a mark ID is and how that is very important in terms of animation in Tableau. We'll then cover some default animation using the pages shelf and animating with filters. And then we'll move on to look at custom animation, so changing date parts, changing from sequential to parallel dates, and various other examples. And then finally, I'll leave you with a few resources and other examples from the community to go and have a look at afterwards. Okay, so what is a mark? So a mark in Tableau is how Tableau renders data in the view. So this could be with a text mark, as we have here. It could be with bars. You see 3 bar marks here. Or it could be with circles. You see we've got 9 circle marks in the view here. And there's various other options. So you could use squares or shapes or pie charts and so on. And you can select these from the marks card in Tableau, as I'm sure many of you are familiar. So one thing just to point out is that the number of marks you see in the view here is not dependent on the size or volume of your data. It's defined by the level of detail, the granularity of the view, which we'll come on to in a second. So for example, this single text mark here could be representing the sales figure for 1 million or even 1 billion rows of data. And these 3 marks in the view here could be generated from just a very small data source with 3 rows of data. So let's talk about view level of detail, or view LOD. So this is determined by the dimensions that you bring into the view, and more specifically to particular shells in the view. So I've highlighted those on the screen on the right here. So it's pretty much anywhere in the view except for the filter shelf or the tooltip shelf in the marks card here. So everything else, any other shelf, would adjust the view level of detail. So in this top example, we can see that the level of detail is a category, that is the granularity of the view. And because we have 3 unique values for category in the underlying data, we're seeing 3 marks. In this bottom view, we have segment in the view as well. And that also happens to have 3 unique values in the data source. And there happens to be a row of data that exists for each unique combination of those 2 dimensions. Therefore, we're getting 3 categories times 3 segments, which equals 9 marks. So we have 9 marks in the view. So that is view level of detail. The next I'm going to talk about mark IDs. So the mark ID is a unique reference for a single mark in the view. And again, this is determined by the dimensions in the view. So it's always, we're talking about dimensions here, not measures. And in that sense, it is quite similar to the view LOD, except that when we talk about view LOD, if I just go back for a second, we're talking about the dimension name. So the view LOD is a category here, or the view LOD is defined by category and segment. But when we talk about mark IDs, we're talking about the individual instances of those dimensions. So for example, in this view, the view LOD is defined by category and ship mode. And the mark ID for each of these marks is the individual instances of those dimensions. So in this case, office supplies and standard class here, or office supplies and second class here, for example. And if I change the state, if I change the filter here, that will change the mark IDs in some cases. And in these 2 cases, the mark ID remains the same. And that means that the animation can occur. So you're seeing different types of animation here. One is that marks are fading out. Another is that marks are fading into view. Another one is that marks are moving. And the type of animation that you see will be defined by the mark IDs and whether they exist in both states or not. So just to make that a bit clearer, you see I've got this table here, and it will show you the mark IDs that exist in 2018 and the mark IDs that exist in 2019. And you can see if the mark ID changes, you're going to have the mark exit the view if it existed in this view but not in the next one. If the mark ID exists in both states, i.e. in 2018 and in 2019, the animation that you'll see is a movement. And the opposite to the first one, if it doesn't exist in 2018, but the mark ID does exist in 2019, then you get the mark entering the view. So these are all different types of animation, but the type that you see will be determined by whether or not the mark IDs exist in the prior and post state. So just to show that again, you can see these two marks are moving smoothly because the mark ID exists in both, and the other cases we're fading out and fading in. Okay, so let's just look at some default animation using the pages shell. So I'm just going to animate this data here, which you see in the top, and you can see the only thing that's in terms of dimensions that is changing is the year, as we go from 16 through to 2020. So you can ignore the measures in terms of mark IDs, we're just looking at these dimensions here. So I have all of these dimensions in the view. I've got year on pages, I've got region item on the text label shelf here. So I mentioned previously that the mark ID is made up of dimensions that are in the view. So there is an exception to that, and that is the pages shelf. So Tableau automatically removes any dimension that you place on the pages shelf from the mark ID. And it does that for a good reason, because if the dimension on the pages shelf was included, then you can see that the mark ID would be changing every year, and as a result would have the mark fading in and out of the view each time, and that's not what we want. But instead, what you can see here is that the mark smoothly transitions and animates across all of those years, because the only thing that's considered for the mark ID are these two dimensions here that are not on the pages shelf. Okay, in this next example, I've just changed one value in one of the dimensions in the region. I've changed it from north to central. So you're seeing now that what will happen is when we animate this now, I only have region on the marks card here. Years is still on pages, so that won't be included in the mark ID. So this would be the only dimension that's considered, and therefore we have a change, so the mark ID will change. But now you're going to see that this mark does fade out of view and come back in again. Okay, I'll just play that back. So what you're seeing is it goes through here, the mark ID doesn't change, so it's smooth animation, and it fades out, fades back in, and then the smooth animation where the mark ID doesn't change. Okay, this time I'm going to add region and item to the view here, so brought item back onto the label shelf as well. Now you can still see that there is a change in this region dimension, but in this particular use case, it's a bit of an edge case where we have pages in use and we have multiple dimensions. And in this case, you might expect the mark to fade out again because you see that dimension is changing. But in fact, what happens in this case is that there's a smooth transition through all of these values. So it's just something to be aware of, that if you are using the pages shelf with multiple other dimensions, they may not all be using the mark ID. You can force them to be included by using the detail shelf. So if you, in this example, I've copied region onto detail, and that will force it to be included in the mark ID. So in this case now, when we animate through here, you'll see that it does fade out of view and then comes back in and then continues on. So the takeaway here, as I say, is just to be aware of if you are using the pages shelf and you're using multiple other dimensions in the view, if you're not seeing the type of animation that you expect to see, just try adding the dimensions onto the detail shelf and see if that changes the animation. Okay, the other option is using the filters to transition through this data. So in this case, we're no longer using the pages shelf, just using filters. And in this case, I don't need to add that region onto detail in this case. If we're using filters, it will automatically add those other dimensions here to the mark ID. So therefore, we do get that fading out, fading in again, and transition. So there's just a couple of use cases to be aware of with pages and filters. So I want to just talk about default animation, how for the most part, for the majority of animations that you create, particularly for business type dashboards and so on, there's really nothing extra that you need to do. You don't need to worry about creating any calculations or parameters. If you just build some standard charts and apply a filter to all of those charts, and then you change that filter, all of this animation will occur automatically. Tableau's really doing all the hard work there. Same for sorting as well. We sort this bar chart here, for example, so all the animation is happening automatically. And if you're not familiar with animations, I'll just show you briefly where you turn them on. So if I go to this chart, for example, Could switch off animations here. You access this panel through the Format menu, the Format Animations, and that panel appears. So at the moment, animation is off, so things just jump around. And if I switch animations on here, then you start to get this smooth animation, this smooth movement of the marks in the view there. Okay. So it really is that simple. So that being said, there may be some examples, some use cases where you want to have slightly different type of animation, and we'll look at doing some of these custom animations now. So this first one is looking at changing the date part in the view. So I have some data here. I'm looking at sales at the monthly level, and I want to be able to aggregate those to the yearly level. This is the type of animation that you might want to create here. And to do that, I'm just going to use a calculation on the column shelf and swap out the date part that's used in this date trunk calculation based on a parameter. So here I have a parameter, which is the date level, and the values are either year or month. And they will go into this first argument of the date trunk calculation here. Now, one thing to note is that the values that I have here are all lowercase, whereas I'm displaying them with the initial letter as an uppercase. And the reason for that is that the argument that goes into this date trunk calculation must all be lowercase. And you can see when it's displayed there in the view, the parameter has the uppercase letter there. Okay, the other thing to note here is just that we should use the simultaneous style of animation in this particular use case. Otherwise, you get a quite choppy animation. I'll just show you that so you can see the difference. So if I change the style here to sequential and then change the parameter, you see the animation kind of happens in two phases there. We'll switch that back to simultaneous there, and we get the smoother effect. Okay, so move on to the next one now. And this is looking at changing the way dates are represented either in parallel or sequentially. And in this first example, I'm showing you how basically not to do it. This is when I was experimenting with the animations when they're in beta. This is how I first tried to do this. And you can see that 2009 is animating as we like, quite smoothly, but the other years are fading in and out of view there. So the way this is done, when I tried this initially, was just using calculation on the column shelf, whereby I returned either the sales date as it is, if the parameter was set to sequential, or if it was set to parallel, I was shifting all the dates back to 2009, which was the first year in the data set. So if it was 2011, I shifted the dates back 2 years. If it was 2012, I shifted them back 3 years, and so on. But the reason this isn't animating smoothly is because I'm changing that dimension that's on the column shelf there. So as we saw earlier, when you change the dimension, you're changing the mark ID, and when the mark ID changes, you get this fading in and out effect. So this is the style of animation that I really want to achieve here, where all of the marks move smoothly in the view, and they're not fading in and out. And the technique to achieve this is to still add those dimensions to the view, but they're not on the column or rows. Instead, they are on the detail shelf. And what I'm doing to determine where the marks are drawn in the view is I'm using a measure instead. And you can see along the bottom here, this is now a number, it's no longer a date. And I'll just show you the calculation I'm using here. So in this case, if the parameter is set to serial, the date diff calculation is returning the difference in months between the first date, which is January 2009, to the sales date. So January 2009 will return 0, February 2009 will return 1, and so on. And then when we get to 2010, we'll go from 12, 13, 14, and so on. And then all I do at the end of the calculation is add 1 so that the dates make a bit more sense. So January is 1, February is 2, and so on. And if instead we have set the parameter to be parallel, then what it does is it returns the difference in months between the first month in each year and the sales date. So the difference between January 2010 and say February 2010 is 1, and then I add 1 to make that 2. So then the February in each year becomes 2, March in every year becomes 3, and so on. And that's the result that you get here. So we see that sequentially the dates go from 1 to 12, and then 13, 24, and so on. And if they're in parallel, You see all the Januaries here are lined up to 1, all the Februaries are lined up to 2, and so on. And because the dimensions are on the detail card but not on the columns, you can see that when we change the view there, those marks move over smoothly. Okay, so this next example is where we're changing the level of detail in the view, or more precisely the perceived level of detail. So again, in this first example here, I'm showing you how I first attended this, and you can see we're getting that fading in and out effect again. So this data is looking at sales at the monthly level, and I have 10 years, so each line represents a year, and I also have category in there as well. So I might want to look at this by year and month, or aggregated just by month only, or at the year the level of category and month. So in this first approach, again, I've swapped out the dimension using the parameter. So when it's on 1, I either return the year. If it's selected on 3, I return category. And if I select 2, then it will return nothing, and therefore it aggregates everything together at the monthly level. But as I say, we have the same problem with swapping out the dimension, therefore that's changing. It changes the mark ID, and therefore the marks fade in and out of the view there. So, same thing, to resolve this, we bring both of the dimensions into the view, put them onto, in this case, we've got them on detail and category here, and then I use a calculation to change the sales value that's on the axis here. So this time, when we change the value, we get this smooth animation as it transitions between the different states there. So in this case, the calculation is excluding the relevant dimension based on what we want to see. So if I want to see the sales by year, then we need to exclude the category. So that's what I do in this first example, exclude category and return the sum of sales, which would be by year only. In the second example, we're aggregating everything together. So in this case, I exclude both the category and the year. And then finally, I exclude the year to return the sales by category. You can see that there. Okay, the next one. So this one is looking at scatter plots, and again, I'm going to change the level of detail, or perceived level of detail, I should say. So in this case, as we move here, you can see these scatter plots split out into the individual states that make up those countries. And it's a similar kind of approach here. I've got both the dimensions in the view, both the country and the state. And I have a calculation here to exclude the state when we are looking at the country level view, or include it when we're just looking at the state level view. So there's two calculations, one for sales and one for profit there. And again, you can see if I select here, I've got 12 items selected, so actually those marks are layered on top of each other. And that was the same in this previous example as well. You can see, for example, I'm showing 10 years here, but there's 6 categories. So what's actually happening is there's a line for each year and category laid on top of each other. So for example, if I highlight, if I select this mark here, I'm actually selecting 6 marks in the view, and you can see the value of that is 6 billion, and 6 billion divided by 6 gives you the 1 billion, which is on the mark on the axis there. Likewise, if we go to the fully aggregated view, I've now got 10 years over 6 months. I've got 60 marks for each month. You can see there I've got 60 items selected there. So it's when I say changing the level of view, it's really the perceived level of detail. The actual level of detail in the view doesn't change because these dimensions never leave the view here. And the final example here is when we have the categories displayed. This time we've got 10 years hidden. We're showing each of the categories, so this time we'll have 10 marks on the select of those. Hopefully that makes sense. And we'll just move on to this final example here. So this time we're looking at animating headers. So in the current release, 2020.3, which just released recently, the headers here don't actually animate. So if we filter this view here, you'll see that the bars do smoothly move across the screen, but the headers jump to their new location. So for most cases that may be totally fine, but if you do want to animate those, it's quite a simple workaround. What we can do is just add in a secondary view here. So these headers are made up of a second view. And this time when I animate, you'll see the headers do move around smoothly on the screen there. Okay, so I'll just show you how this is done. I've got one view here and a second one here. If you just go into this view, you can see I'm using a dummy measure up here, which is just a minimum of 1. And the axis goes from 0 up to 1 here, so you can see all the marks will be rendered down the right-hand side. And I have my subcategory in the view here, so I generate a mark for each subcategory. And then the really important point to note is that any filters that you have applied to this view must also be applied to the other view that has the bars in. And the same thing for the sorting as well. And that will just make sure that any sorting and filtering in either view will make sure that both the marks and the headers are aligned. And just to show you that, what I'll do is go into this view. I'll turn on the headers for a second. And then we'll go back here. You can see I need to hide this header to bring these in alignment here, then misaligned. The other thing you can do is use padding and so on to make sure that everything lines up here. So now when I change these filters here, you can see that things are moving around and everything lines up. And once you're happy with that, you can then hide these headers here. Okay, and you get your animated headers. Okay, great. So that was the last example I wanted to step through in detail. So just wanted to finish off with a few examples of some more advanced animations that have been generated, shared in the community, and a few of the blogs as well. So there's a blog by Marc who's actually written a series of blogs, one for each kind of chart type. Definitely worth checking those out. And there's a blog by Alex Farmeloff, who's been doing some really great work around animations and various other work as well with 3D you've now seen. And there's a blog by Liam Spencer that's written recently where he looks at creating complex animations. And I'll show you that workbook in a second. So here's some of the workbooks here, and we can just open some of these up. This one from Alex, and this one from him, and then finally this one from Klaus. So this is an example that Klaus did for Viz recently. So this first one here from Alex is looking at transitioning between chart types. So as you move the parameter here, you can see we're going from the stacked bar, and then it moves into a kind of a line chart here, and then onwards to other chart types. So again, it's using measures, keeping all the dimensions in the view so the mark IDs don't change, and you get the smooth animation. And you can download this as well from Alex's public profile. This second one from Liam is also for Make Up a Monday, looking at mental health issues. And as you step through the story here, the story points that Liam's created, you'll see the marks in the view move around and they generate these waffle charts here. I won't step through every point here, but just to show you the animation taking place. You can see that then they move back to this prior state here, and you get the kind of story being told as you step through here. So really nice visualization, and then the blog post that Liam has on his talk through how he created that in some detail. So just checking that out. And then there's this one example from Klaus, as I say. So Klaus did this in a mobile format, and did this for the recent IMVs. You can see a minute here, and you can see that as we step through here, for example, these squares on the map will then transition into this tree map, and then they transition into these bars that you can come up shortly. And there's a bunch of other animations that Klaus has in here. I'll just show you this final one where we have some view on a map here. So these dots on the map, as we step through, transition into this scatter plot view, and then finally move into just a plot view here with these blue bars. So all of that's done again using some of these similar techniques where you're making sure the mark IDs remain the same as you transition through the different states there. So there's lots of examples to look at and learn more from. And I'll just leave you with some other links as well. So there's some links to TABLEAU conference videos that were shared as part of TC19 last year by John McKinley and Phil Isaacson from Ranjo, and a couple of help pages as well on formatting animations and level of detail. So lots of information to look at there. And if you're looking for more examples, there's plenty more. If you search for the hashtag VizAnimations on either Twitter or Tablet Public, you'll find many more examples. And just finally, I just want to give a shout out to Bill Isaacs at Tableau, who's was very generous with his time and answering a lot of my questions about animation and on reviewing, giving some feedback on this content. So thanks, Paul, for your time. And that's really it from me. So I'll hand back to you, Sagar. I'm happy to take any questions in the remaining time if there are any.
Thank you, Mark, for that. I think it was a great session just about animation, right? So if you have any questions with respect to animation or you want to ask Mark something about Tableau, just go ahead and put it in the Q&A tab. So Mark, I have one question for you, and it's about, so when you are going ahead and loading some data in Tableau, right? And you have that spinner which goes ahead and loads information. So Anil is asking how animation works with load spinner, right? When we change the filter, a loader comes up and reloads the dashboard. How does that work with animation?
So I'm not 100% sure I understand the question there. So obviously when you change the state and you're animating between two states, there may be some load time involved. It's a complex view that you have. So you may still see that spinner, for example, if it's very complex. Is that what you mean?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
And
so you may still see that if it's a very complex view.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Mark, sorry.
Yeah, that was really it. I was just going to say, if you're animating between very complex views, you may still see that spinner come up if that's required.
Okay. And the next question is how we can move the dimensions ranking as well in animation when the value changes over the years.
So how can you change the ranking when the year changes? So it really depends how you've set up your view, I guess. So if you're, for example, here I'm sorting by sales value, you could just try and understand the question a bit more. So you want to sort the values based on sales for every year, for example. I guess might be what you're saying there. So in which case you
Yeah,
might have the pages shelf in the view here. You can have a pages shelf based on year, and then as you page through those years, it will effectively filter the data to each of those years and sort based accordingly. Does that answer the question?
okay. I think we'll wait for her reply. And Mark, I have one question for you. And this is more with respect to how are you using animation with respect to your business dashboards, right? And this is something which I'm struggling with my customers in financial sectors, right? They just love working with cross tabs, right? So do you have any tips and tricks and feedback on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, currently where I'm based, we don't have the animation release, so I'm not actually using in a business context. But I mean, I've just brought this, talking about default animations here. I think they do help a lot in terms of just being able to track what's happening in the view. It just makes it much easier to see things move around when animations are switched on versus when they're switched off. So I think it really does help to enable you to tell that story as you're moving through certain visualizations. Obviously, if you're dealing with people who are only looking at sort of crosstabs, that's not so relevant. But if you are, particularly when you're, I think, telling stories in a business context in presentations, and you're sharing information which perhaps your colleagues are only seeing for the first time, they're not familiar with the data, and you're stepping through different views of it, I think having those animations on can be super helpful. So that would be the kind of general advice there. I mean, it's really applicable to, depends on the use case that you're looking at. If people are very familiar and the views are very simple and everyone understands the data, then animations may have less value. It really depends on the use case, I think.
Okay, thank you. If you have any other questions, just put away in the Q&A tab or in the chat. Happy to ask Mark about it. And Mark, do you want to talk about how did you start your journey with Tableau, right? Any tips and tricks for the beginners if you want to give some advice to them?
Yeah, so I started my journey, say, about 3.5 years ago, and I went to the data school program at the Information Lab. So it was quite a unique opportunity, quite a nice place to start with Tableau, because there's so many kind of skilled professionals there. So there's a lot of people to learn from, and have the opportunity to learn Tableau with Andy Kriebel there, Tableau's Zen Master. So I was quite fortunate in that sense. But I think if you're just learning Tableau yourself or in your work or what have you, there's a kind of unending amount of blog posts and sites that you can go to now. I know you've shared a few of those, Sagar, already. But I would also recommend getting on Twitter as well. A lot of the community aspects of Tableau do have them via Twitter at the moment, so you can follow some folks on there and we'll share visualizations and blog posts. And then, of course, you can take part in some of the many community initiatives such as Makeover Monday and Workout Wednesday and Iron Quest and so on. And I'm sure people have shared those links to those in past sessions on VizConnect here. So yeah, that would be my general advice. Just start to engage with the community as much as you can, follow folks, and also put stuff out there. Don't be afraid to share your work, and don't be put off by things that people are sharing in the community. If you don't think you're up to the same standard, that's obviously totally fine. People are very welcoming in the community and will support and encourage you. So just dive in, really.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark, for that. And everyone is asking, Mark, whether you will go ahead and share this slide maybe on your blog or Tableau Public.
Yes, absolutely. So I do have blog posts to accompany this information. I'll be sharing. Look to publish that blog later today. And this workbook that I've worked through today, this will be on my Tableau Public. You'll be able to download that and look at all the calculations and everything that's happening behind the scenes there. So yeah, that will be shared later today.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark, for your time today. I think it was an honor to have you on VizConnect. I think before closing it, just wanted to congratulate you on being a Zen Master, right? So, like, how's that experience? Do you want to share and talk something about that?
Yeah, I don't have really too much to say. I mean, it's obviously a great honour. It was a bit of a surprise, but yeah, it's really nice to be recognised in community, and hopefully sort of the work and the information and blogs and things that I'm sharing are helpful for folks in the community. But yeah, it's a great honour. So yeah, thanks very much, Sagar. I appreciate it, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I know we've been having a discussion about this for a number of months, so glad to finally come on VizConnect and share some information with the community. So thanks again for the invite.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. I think with that, thank you everyone for joining VizConnect. We'll see you next week. Take care of yourself. Be safe. Bye-bye. Have a great weekend ahead.
Thanks, everyone.